I was stunned, frozen in disbelief, as a chilling realization washed over me. It hadn't been a dream. All these years, I had convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a nightmare born out of a child's fear of the dark. But no, it was far more terrifying than I ever wanted to believe. It happened just a few days ago, as I sat in my parents' house, feeling the warmth of the fire, the comfort of family. It should have been an ordinary evening, like any other. But something was off that night, something creeping just beneath the surface. My mother had been acting strangely for weeks, hearing things, seeing things out of the corner of her eye, things she refused to fully explain. We hadn't dared talk about it until that moment, when, as if carried by some invisible force, our conversation turned to the unsettling, stories of the unexplained, of the supernatural. That's when my mother, with a strange heaviness in her voice, began to recount an event buried deep in the past. Something we had all been there for, though we'd never really spoken about it. And as she started to tell the story, something inside me shifted, a tightening in my chest. I realized, with growing horror, that the story was more than just familiar, it was something I had carried with me for years, in the dark corners of my mind. She spoke of that evening, the one when we were walking to my grandmother's house. It was late, the sky a bruised purple, the air thick with the kind of silence that swallows up even the sound of your own footsteps. I was only 6 years old then, barely old enough to remember, or so I thought. But my mother's voice, low and deliberate, began to stir up memories I had long buried. The four of us, my father, my mother, my sister, and I, were walking down that familiar path, a trail we had taken countless times before. But that evening, something felt different. The wind was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that feels wrong, like the calm before a storm that never comes. And then, we saw her. A woman, dressed entirely in white, emerged from the shadows. She wasn't walking, she was floating, her body moving effortlessly above the ground, her feet hidden beneath the flowing fabric of her gown. In her hands, she held a bowl, an old, weathered thing that seemed to radiate an unsettling energy. I remember her face, pale and expressionless, like a mask. Her eyes were fixed ahead, unblinking, as if she wasn't really there, or worse, as if she was there but not meant to be seen. The four of us froze. Time itself seemed to slow, our breath caught in our throats. My father stepped forward, instinctively, perhaps out of some protective urge, but the rest of us stayed back, rooted in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. The woman turned without a sound, her body gliding toward the wheat field beside the path. She moved so effortlessly, her presence disturbing the wheat in her wake, the tall stalks bending unnaturally as if something unseen was following her. Yet, no wind touched us. My father, unable to resist, began to follow her. My mother clutched my sister and me tightly to her chest, and I could feel her heart pounding through her skin. I wanted to cry out, to scream for him to stop, but I couldn't. Something was wrong. The very air around us felt thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on us, suffocating. We watched as my father followed her into the field, his figure slowly swallowed by the sea of wheat. Beyond the field lay the river, a slow, winding body of water we had crossed many times before. I don't know what he was thinking, what made him keep going, but he reached the riverbank, and she was gone. She hadn't crossed the river. There was no possible way she could have. But she had vanished, as if she had simply dissolved into the mist rising from the water. I'll never forget the look on my father's face when he returned to us. He was pale, almost as white as the woman herself. He didn't say much, just muttered for us to keep walking. But his voice was different, hollow, as if something had broken inside him. We walked the rest of the way in silence, the oppressive feeling lingering long after the woman disappeared. As my mother told this story now, her voice wavering slightly, I felt something stir deep within me. A long-forgotten memory clawed its way to the surface, tearing through the years of denial I had built around it. And then, I realized with a shock so violent it nearly knocked me from my chair, it wasn't a dream. I shot to my feet, my heart racing. That wasn't a dream? I stammered, barely able to find the words. My whole body felt cold, as if the room had suddenly dropped in temperature. I've had that dream for years. It haunted me, I thought. I thought it was just a nightmare. But my mother shook her head slowly, her eyes dark and distant, as if she were still seeing the woman in white. No, she whispered, her voice carrying a weight I had never heard before. It was real. We all saw her. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. From that day on, I knew the world wasn't what I thought it was. There are things out there that don't belong in our world. I glanced at my father, who had been silent the whole time. His face had gone ashen, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. His eyes were unfocused, lost in the memory of that night. He hadn't spoken of it since, and even now, he seemed too terrified to acknowledge it. That night, after we left my parents' house, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, drifting through the wheat, her white dress brushing against the tall stalks, her empty eyes staring straight ahead. And I knew now, with a deep, gnawing certainty, that she wasn't just a dream. She was something far worse, something real, something waiting in the dark places where we dare not look. And the memory of her is no longer just a haunting dream, it's a part of me. Forever.